The first sound is a voice calling 911 in the early hours of December 9, 2001. Michael Peterson tells the dispatcher that his wife, Kathleen, has fallen down the stairs. His words are hurried, uneven, and filled with panic. He describes blood, says she is still breathing, and pleads for help to arrive quickly. The operator instructs him to stay on the line and checks whether Kathleen is conscious. Peterson repeats that she is still alive but fading. The call captures a scene no one else can see yet, only his description of what lies at the bottom of the staircase. Minutes later, emergency responders enter the home in Durham, North Carolina. They find Kathleen Peterson lying on her back at the foot of a narrow stairway. Her head is bloodied, her clothing stained, and the wooden floor beneath her is slick with red. Paramedics try to assist her, applying oxygen, checking vital signs, and preparing to move her if possible. Despite these efforts, her injuries are severe and her pulse is weak. Within a short period of time, Kathleen is pronounced dead at the scene. The responders carefully document the surroundings. The staircase shows blood spatter on the walls and pooling at the base. Patterns of drops and smears extend up several steps. The scene appears complex, with multiple stains and lacerations on Kathleen's scalp. Some responders note the volume of blood is unusual for a simple fall. Others continue their routine, focusing on preserving the area for investigators who will arrive later. The house is quiet except for the equipment of the paramedics and the low voices of officers entering the residence. Police secure the property soon after. They separate Michael Peterson and begin routine questioning. He repeats that he found his wife at the bottom of the stairs after returning to the area from outside. He explains that she had been drinking wine, may have been unsteady, and could have slipped. Officers listen but also begin forming their own observations. The staircase becomes the focus. Every mark, every trace is noted as possible evidence. As the night moves into morning, detectives and technicians start their work. They photograph the blood patterns in detail. They collect samples and measure distances between stains. They record the number and location of Kathleen's wounds. The presence of so much blood prompts them to consider more than one explanation. They cannot yet say whether the injuries resulted from a fall or something else, but they begin framing questions that will guide the investigation. The 911 recording becomes a key piece of the timeline. Investigators replay it to study Peterson's tone, his pauses, and his descriptions. To some, the urgency sounds genuine. To others, the words leave gaps that raise suspicion. Still, no conclusion is reached at this stage. The recording is preserved as part of the growing case file. By daylight, the house has shifted from a private residence to a controlled crime scene. Yellow tape restricts movement. Neighbors begin to notice police cars outside and word spreads quickly. For many, the idea of violence in this quiet neighborhood seems far away. Yet officers treat the scene as potentially suspicious until evidence shows otherwise. The Peterson family home is now frozen in time while investigators search for clarity. The body is taken to the medical examiner for autopsy. The pathologist will later be asked to determine cause and manner of death. At this point, the only certainty is that Kathleen Peterson died at the bottom of her staircase and that her head wounds are severe. How those wounds occurred is unresolved. Every option remains under review, from a tragic accident to something more deliberate. In the hours following Kathleen's death, the Peterson household is filled with silence broken only by the work of investigators. What began as a frantic phone call is now a formal case file. The question shifts from what happened in those final minutes to why it happened, and whether anyone is responsible beyond the simple mechanics of a fall. This is the starting point. A woman is dead, a husband is the only witness, and a staircase holds marks that can be read in more than one way. The investigation is only beginning. Next, we turn away from the immediate scene and look more closely at who Michael and Kathleen Peterson were, and how their lives appeared to those who lived nearby. Durham, North Carolina, in 2001 was a place of quiet streets and comfortable neighborhoods. On Cedar Street, Michael Peterson was known to many as a friendly neighbor. He had a reputation for being talkative, witty, and easy to approach. He wrote columns and books, including works of fiction and commentary, which gave him a public profile beyond his block. People often described him as confident, sometimes charismatic, and always eager to share his views. His home, a large house with multiple floors, became a recognizable landmark in the area. Kathleen Peterson lived there too, and her life looked different from Michael's but equally busy. She was a high-ranking executive at Nortel Networks, a major telecommunications company. Her workdays were long, filled with meetings, deadlines, and constant pressure. She was often described as ambitious and efficient, someone who carried significant responsibility. To those who knew her professionally, Kathleen was respected as hardworking and capable. At home, she was also seen as warm and caring, often trying to balance her demanding career with her family life. Together, Michael and Kathleen presented the image of a successful couple. They hosted gatherings, shared dinners with friends, and raised children in a blended household. Between them, there were 5 children from previous relationships and family ties, Kathleen's daughter Caitlin, and Michael's 2 sons, Todd and Clayton, along with 2 adopted daughters, Margaret and Martha, who had lost their mother years earlier. The family dynamic appeared close-knit, at least on the surface. Neighbors remembered laughter, conversations drifting from the porch, and the ordinary rhythms of suburban life. Behind the outward picture, there were stresses common to many households. Money was one issue. Kathleen's job was well paid, but Nortel was beginning to face trouble as the company struggled in a downturn. This created anxiety about stability and finances. Michael's career as a writer had once been strong but had slowed, producing less income than before. The couple maintained a large home and lifestyle that depended heavily on Kathleen's earnings. This strain was not always visible, but those close to them noted the pressure it placed on their relationship. The social world around them also added expectations. Michael liked to be seen as accomplished, someone with influence and recognition. Kathleen was admired for her ability to manage demanding work while maintaining appearances at home. Together, they seemed like a family that had achieved balance, but that balance was fragile. Any disruption risked pulling at deeper concerns about status, reputation, and security. These issues, while ordinary in many respects, would later be studied closely as part of the wider story. The Peterson home itself played a central role. It was spacious, filled with books, furniture, and personal history. The staircase where Kathleen would later be found was a central feature, narrow and steep, connecting the floors of the house. Friends had walked those stairs many times during visits. No one thought of them as dangerous, but in the weeks after Kathleen's death, the staircase would become more than a household detail. It would become a point of focus for investigators, attorneys, and experts trying to explain how one night ended in tragedy. For neighbors and friends, Michael and Kathleen seemed like people they could trust. They appeared engaged with their community, sharing meals, offering help, and maintaining friendships. The family's blended structure made the house lively, sometimes chaotic, but outwardly stable. The idea that something violent could happen inside was difficult for many to imagine. The first news of Kathleen's death spread quickly, and shock was the first reaction from those who knew them. As investigators began to look more closely, they had to move beyond appearances. It was not enough to rely on public impressions of the perfect neighbor, or the respected executive. They needed to examine the pressures inside the household, the habits, the arguments, and the secrets that might exist beneath the surface. What seemed like a strong family could also hold private tensions. These possibilities formed the background against which the investigation would unfold. The couple's social standing and reputation meant the case attracted attention. Newspapers and television stations began to report details within hours of Kathleen's death. Reporters emphasized Michael's role as a writer and Kathleen's role as a successful business executive. Their names carried weight, making the story larger than an ordinary domestic incident. This publicity would follow every stage of the case, influencing how the public saw Michael and how the community judged what happened. In the end, the staircase in their home was no longer just part of a house. It was the place where outward appearances collided with hidden tensions. Investigators would soon return to that staircase, not just as a physical structure but as a silent witness that might explain whether Kathleen fell, was attacked, or suffered something in between. Next, we turn to the detailed work of reading the blood patterns that covered those walls and steps. The work of investigators inside the Peterson home quickly centered on the blood. The staircase walls, steps, and floor showed an unusual volume of staining. Photographs were taken of every angle, every drip, and every smear. Technicians measured distances between spots, looking for direction and force. The goal was simple: to determine whether the blood pattern fit the story of a fall or whether it suggested something more violent. The process was careful, but the impressions formed early. Many officers found the scene inconsistent with a single accidental tumble. At the autopsy, Kathleen Peterson's injuries were recorded in detail. The medical examiner noted multiple lacerations on her scalp, ranging in size and depth. Some cuts were described as long and thin, others as wider and irregular. Importantly, there were no skull fractures. Her brain showed no swelling, which often occurs after blunt trauma. These findings stood out. The wounds looked serious, but they did not match the damage usually caused by a heavy object striking the head with force. Yet the quantity of blood seemed greater than what many expected from a simple fall down the stairs. The official ruling from the medical examiner was homicide. This meant the injuries were judged to be the result of an assault rather than an accident. The reasoning came from the number and pattern of scalp lacerations, the large amount of blood, and the spread of stains up the staircase. Prosecutors accepted this finding and built their theory around blunt force trauma. To them, the repeated lacerations suggested multiple blows with an object. They pointed to a missing fireplace tool, a blow poke, as a possible weapon. It was not present when police searched, and its absence became a detail of interest. The defense responded with a different interpretation. They emphasized the lack of skull fractures and the absence of brain injury as signs that no heavy object had been used. Their position was that Kathleen fell, hit her head more than once on the stairs, and bled heavily. Alcohol consumption was noted, her blood alcohol content was elevated. Defense attorneys argued this could have impaired her balance and increased the severity of a fall. According to them, the blood was extensive because scalp wounds bleed heavily, not because of repeated blows. Forensic experts brought in by both sides gave contrasting accounts. State experts described impact angles and cast-off stains, claiming these were marks of intentional striking. Defense experts countered that blood dynamics can vary widely, and falls on hard surfaces can create similar patterns. Each photograph, each diagram, was subject to interpretation. What one side labeled proof of violence, the other side called compatible with accident. This clash defined the early stages of the case and showed how the same evidence could tell two different stories. Inside the house, the sound of ordinary life continued even as investigators tested and sampled. The refrigerator ran, the heating system clicked, and the wooden staircase gave off small creaks when stepped on. These quiet details marked the difference between the living space it had been and the crime scene it became. Every creak seemed to remind investigators of the unanswered question, whether Kathleen's last moments were a tragic accident or a violent act. The photographic record became central to future proceedings. Enlarged images of the blood spatter, diagrams of drop direction, and charts of wound patterns were prepared for eventual trial. Each image was meant to fix the scene in the jury's mind, even though experts could not agree on its meaning. This reliance on visual interpretation made the case complex. Jurors would later be asked to choose between two narratives built on the same pictures. The defense pointed out that no clear weapon was ever recovered. The missing blow poke was suggested, but without physical confirmation it remained a theory. The lack of fractures made that theory weaker in their eyes. Prosecutors countered that not all blunt instruments cause fractures and that absence of the tool did not remove its likelihood. This exchange underscored how much rested on interpretation rather than direct proof. As days passed, the investigation expanded. Prosecutors looked for motive to strengthen their claim of homicide. Defense attorneys began gathering medical records and consulting accident specialists. Both sides built on the same foundation: the staircase, the blood, and the wounds. The same set of facts was being stretched into two possible stories, each with serious consequences. With the medical examiner's ruling in hand and opposing views forming, the case moved toward the courtroom. The next step would be to build a murder theory that prosecutors believed could persuade a jury, while the defense worked to hold to the idea of accident. The staircase had been examined in detail, but the arguments about what it meant were only beginning. The picture by this stage was divided into two clear paths. On one side was the state's version, built on the autopsy ruling of homicide and the visible blood patterns. Prosecutors argued that Kathleen Peterson's injuries showed multiple blows to the head with a blunt object. The missing fireplace blow poke was suggested as the likely weapon. They told investigators it had been seen in the home before but could not be found after Kathleen's death. To them, its absence carried weight. They added motive to the theory: tension in the marriage, financial pressure, and secrets that might have placed strain on the couple's life together. The state also focused on Kathleen's role as the primary earner. Nortel's troubles meant her job was less secure than before, and her income supported their large house and lifestyle. Prosecutors suggested this created stress that could have led to conflict. They also hinted at undisclosed parts of Michael's private life that could have upset the marriage. None of these factors alone was presented as proof, but together they were shaped into a framework. In their view, Michael Peterson had reasons, opportunity, and the missing tool that could explain how Kathleen died. The defense constructed an alternative. They said Kathleen had consumed alcohol that evening and had been drinking wine by the pool shortly before her death. They pointed to her elevated blood alcohol level as a factor in her balance and coordination. According to their account, she attempted to climb the staircase, slipped, and struck her head multiple times on the wooden steps and walls. They explained the volume of blood as consistent with scalp injuries, which can bleed heavily even without deep trauma. They repeated that no skull fracture and no brain swelling were found, which undermined the state's idea of repeated blows from a weapon. To make this case clearer, the defense laid out the absence of direct proof. There was no murder weapon found. The blow poke was only a suggestion, never recovered, never tested. They highlighted that investigators themselves had not observed evidence of cleaning or concealment of such an object. Without it, the state's explanation relied on speculation rather than material evidence. In contrast, they said, an accidental fall was straightforward and required no missing item. Both versions rested heavily on interpretation. The blood patterns could be seen as impact spatter or as the result of a fall with movement and attempts to get up. The lacerations could be described as consistent with blows or with repeated contact against hard surfaces. Each fact was pulled in opposite directions. The jury would eventually be asked to decide which narrative carried more weight, even though both were built on the same limited set of physical details. What added to the uncertainty was that the staircase itself was not unusual. It was steep, narrow, and hard. Friends who had been in the home described it as a place where a fall could easily cause injury. Yet others said they could not imagine such catastrophic bleeding from one accident. This disagreement mirrored the divide between prosecution and defense, a gap that would only widen as the case moved forward. The courtroom setting was already being prepared in the minds of both sides. Prosecutors organized exhibits, photographs, and expert witnesses to explain their murder theory. The defense lined up specialists to counter each claim with accident-based explanations. Both sides knew the case would hinge less on new discoveries and more on persuading jurors which story best fit the facts. Neighbors, friends, and family began to realize that the process would not be brief. The idea of a quick resolution faded. Instead, the death at the staircase was becoming the center of a long legal contest. Every statement, every observation, and every photo from that night would be brought into the courtroom for close examination. The competing versions, murder with a missing weapon, or accident from a fall, were now locked in place. Neither side had full proof, and both required the jury to accept a narrative over gaps in certainty. The doors of the courtroom were about to open, and each side was preparing to step through. Before that trial began, however, investigators uncovered information that linked Michael Peterson to an earlier death, years before, at another staircase. That discovery would soon expand the case in unexpected ways. In the weeks after Kathleen Peterson's death, investigators uncovered an older case that shifted the direction of their work. In 1985, while Michael Peterson was living in Germany, a family friend named Elizabeth Ratliff had been found dead at the bottom of a staircase in her home. At the time, German authorities concluded she had died from a cerebral hemorrhage, which caused her to fall. The death was ruled accidental, and the matter was closed. Peterson had been among the last to see her alive, and he had helped care for her two young daughters after her death. Those daughters, Margaret and Martha, were later adopted by Peterson and raised as part of his family. When investigators in Durham learned of this earlier death, they saw a pattern they believed could be significant. Two women connected to Michael Peterson, both found at the bottom of staircases, both with head injuries and blood at the scene. To them, the similarity was too close to ignore. The prosecution requested that Ratliff's body be exhumed for a new autopsy. Her remains were brought from Texas, where she had been buried, to North Carolina for examination. The exhumation was carried out in 2003, nearly 18 years after Ratliff's death. The medical examiner in North Carolina conducted a new autopsy and concluded that her injuries were consistent with homicide. This directly contradicted the original findings from Germany, which had listed natural causes. The reclassification of Ratliff's death provided prosecutors with a narrative link. They now had two staircase deaths connected by one man, which they argued showed more than coincidence. For the defense, the introduction of Ratliff's case was a major challenge. They argued that the circumstances in Germany were completely different. Ratliff had a known medical condition, including a history of headaches and neurological symptoms. The original autopsy had not described the scene as suspicious. Friends and authorities at the time had accepted it as a tragic medical event followed by a fall. To reopen the case nearly 2 decades later, they said, was an overreach intended only to prejudice the jury against Peterson. The prosecution maintained that the similarities could not be dismissed. They highlighted that in both cases, blood was found on the walls and floor near staircases. They pointed to the scalp lacerations, the location of the bodies, and the personal connection to Michael Peterson. They presented these parallels as a pattern, an echo that showed the probability of violence rather than accident. This became a central piece of their strategy as they prepared for trial. The defense countered by emphasizing the limits of memory and evidence after so many years. Witnesses from 1985 were difficult to locate, and some recollections were vague. The German authorities who had overseen the case were not in agreement with the new homicide ruling. The defense said the re-examination was less about science and more about creating a story to influence jurors in North Carolina. They reminded the court that Ratliff's daughters, who had lived with Michael since her death, continued to support him and did not believe he had harmed their mother. The clash over Ratliff's death added weight to the case against Peterson. Instead of one unexplained event, prosecutors now told jurors they were dealing with two. The defense insisted they were unrelated, separated by time, geography, and circumstance. But the inclusion of the German case gave the state the ability to argue that Kathleen's death was not an isolated incident but part of a disturbing pattern. For the jury pool, this new information raised the stakes. They were not only being asked to decide what happened on one December night in Durham but to consider whether history had repeated itself. Jury selection began under this shadow, with attorneys probing potential jurors on how they would interpret such parallels. The process showed how difficult it would be to separate fact from suggestion once the two deaths were linked in the courtroom. As the trial moved closer, the staircase in Durham and the staircase in Germany were tied together in legal arguments. Whether coincidence or connection, they formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. The defense prepared to challenge every detail, but the issue was no longer only about one night in 2001. The story now stretched across continents and decades. With the past brought into the present, the trial opened as a complex battle. Exhibits, witnesses, and experts filled the courtroom, each side aiming to convince the jury of their version. What followed was a trial that became as much performance as procedure, where every detail of blood, wounds, and motive was placed under scrutiny. The trial of Michael Peterson began in 2003 and quickly became one of the most closely watched cases in North Carolina. The courtroom was arranged with careful order, but the atmosphere carried the weight of spectacle. On one side sat the prosecution, equipped with photos of blood patterns, diagrams of the staircase, and evidence from the exhumation of Elizabeth Ratliff. On the other side sat the defense, prepared to argue that Kathleen Peterson's death was a tragic fall. The jury, drawn from the local community, was instructed to listen carefully, but they faced weeks of conflicting accounts and competing experts. The prosecution presented its case methodically. They introduced the autopsy ruling of homicide and repeated that Kathleen's injuries were not consistent with a fall. They described the missing blow poke as the likely weapon, showing jurors where it once stood in the home and emphasizing its absence after Kathleen's death. Witnesses were called to speak about the marriage, the financial strains, and aspects of Michael Peterson's private life. Each point was used to create a picture of motive. To reinforce their position, they introduced the Ratliff case, insisting that two women tied to Peterson dying at the bottom of staircases could not be coincidence. Key to the state's case was testimony from bloodstain analyst Dwayne Deaver of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. Deaver explained the blood patterns in confident, precise language. He described cast-off stains, directionality, and spatter consistent, in his opinion, with multiple blows from a blunt object. Jurors were shown photos alongside his explanations. His testimony gave the prosecution a scientific anchor, something presented as objective proof that Kathleen's death was not an accident. The defense worked to dismantle each point. They argued that Kathleen's elevated blood alcohol level made a fall likely and her injuries explainable without a weapon. They stressed that there was no skull fracture, no brain swelling, and no physical evidence of a blow poke. They cross-examined experts, pressing on the possibility that stair edges could have caused the wounds. On the Ratliff case, they reminded the jury of the decades that had passed and the original medical conclusion of natural death. They urged the jury not to treat coincidence as evidence. Still, the state's presentation carried momentum. Deaver's testimony in particular appeared persuasive, as he spoke with clarity and assurance. To jurors unfamiliar with forensic science, his words had the force of authority. The defense attempted to counter by presenting their own experts, but much of their testimony was complex and less direct. This imbalance of style, if not substance, played a role in how the case was received. The trial stretched on for weeks, with exhibits and witnesses filling the record. Each day, the jury watched as lawyers laid out diagrams of the staircase, replayed the 911 call, and compared photographs from two deaths nearly 20 years apart. The process was less about uncovering new facts and more about framing old ones into a convincing story. Observers noted that the courtroom often felt more like a stage than a simple legal forum. When closing arguments came, the prosecution returned to its central theme: Kathleen's injuries could not be explained by accident, and Peterson had motive, means, and opportunity. The defense asked jurors to remember the lack of direct evidence and the plausibility of a fall. The jury retired to deliberate, carrying with them stacks of evidence and the weight of two possible narratives. The verdict was announced on October 10, 2003. Michael Peterson was found guilty of the murder of Kathleen Peterson. The decision was read in a quiet courtroom, but its impact was heavy. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For some, it felt like resolution. For others, the questions about what had truly happened remained. As Peterson was taken into custody, the case did not end. Appeals were filed, and arguments about the fairness of the trial began almost immediately. Supporters questioned the reliability of the bloodstain analysis and the fairness of introducing the Ratliff case. Critics argued that the verdict had relied more on narrative than on certainty. The questions that had started at the bottom of a staircase now continued inside a prison. The conviction closed one chapter but opened another. Years later, the credibility of the very expert who helped secure Peterson's conviction would come under scrutiny, shaking the foundation of the state's case. After Michael Peterson's conviction, the case appeared settled. He began serving a life sentence without parole, and the prosecution had secured the outcome it sought. But in the years that followed, new scrutiny fell on the work of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. Internal audits and external reviews uncovered troubling problems at the state crime lab. Among the issues were errors in testing, incomplete reporting, and failures to disclose results that did not support prosecutions. These findings spread across dozens of cases, and they soon reached back to the Peterson trial. At the center was bloodstain analyst Dwayne Deaver, whose confident testimony had been a cornerstone of the state's case. Deaver had told jurors that the blood patterns on the staircase walls proved Kathleen was struck repeatedly with a blunt object. His testimony was presented as scientific and certain. But after the audits, questions emerged about his methods. It was revealed that he had not always followed accepted scientific protocols. In some cases, he had withheld results that might have helped the defense. His record showed a pattern of overstating findings in favor of the prosecution. For the defense, this information was crucial. They argued that Peterson's conviction rested heavily on Deaver's testimony, and if that testimony was unreliable, the verdict could not stand. Attorneys filed motions for a new trial, citing misconduct and unreliable science. The courts began reviewing the claims, and hearings were scheduled to examine the scope of the problems at the SBI lab. Deaver himself became the subject of disciplinary action, and his credibility as an expert was seriously damaged. In open court, judges heard evidence about how Deaver had handled bloodstain analysis. It was shown that he often tailored his language to support prosecution theories rather than presenting neutral science. This was not only in Peterson's case but in others as well. The revelations led to his suspension and eventual dismissal from the SBI. For Peterson, these developments meant a door had opened, even after years in prison, for his case to be reconsidered. In December 2011, Judge Orlando Hudson, who had presided over the original trial, ruled that Peterson should be granted a new trial. The decision was based largely on the finding that Deaver's testimony had misled the jury and that his credibility had been compromised. After 8 years in prison, Peterson was released on bond to await retrial. His case, once thought closed, was now back in motion. The ruling did not answer the core question of what happened to Kathleen, but it did highlight how fragile the foundation of the original conviction had been. If the jury had relied on testimony later deemed unreliable, then the fairness of the entire process was in doubt. The state prepared to retry the case, but the defense now had stronger grounds to challenge every piece of forensic evidence. The retrial promised to be long and complex, but it also carried the chance of a different outcome. For Peterson and his family, the release brought both relief and uncertainty. He was no longer in prison, but he was not cleared. The legal process restarted, with hearings, motions, and preparation for another full trial. The case had already stretched nearly a decade, and it was clear it would continue for years more. The central figure remained the same, a staircase covered in blood, and the question of how Kathleen died. At this stage, the case seemed to rest only on competing versions of accident or attack. But as the retrial loomed, an unusual idea surfaced. It did not come from prosecutors or defense attorneys at first, but it would capture public attention and add yet another layer to the already complicated story. It became known as the owl theory. The so-called owl theory emerged quietly but soon became one of the most unusual aspects of the Peterson case. It was not part of the original trial but surfaced later, as defense attorneys and independent observers revisited the evidence. The idea was that Kathleen's scalp wounds might not have been caused by a fall or by a blunt object, but instead by an animal attack outside the house. Specifically, a barred owl, common in North Carolina, was suggested as the possible cause of her injuries. This theory was unconventional, but it drew attention because it addressed details the other explanations had not. The starting point for the owl theory was the shape of Kathleen's wounds. Some of the cuts on her scalp were thin and parallel, spaced in a way that resembled claw marks more than random lacerations. Supporters of the theory pointed out that barred owls have sharp talons capable of leaving such marks. Microscopic feathers were later reported to have been found on Kathleen's hair and clothing, though they were not identified during the original investigation. To those who favored this explanation, the combination of unusual wounds and feather traces was more than coincidence. The timeline also fit the possibility. Kathleen had been outside near the pool before she entered the house for the last time. Owls are known to be territorial and aggressive during nesting season. An attack could have startled her, caused bleeding, and left her disoriented. If she then tried to make her way inside and up the stairs, her condition could have worsened, leading to a fall and more blood loss. In this version, the death remained accidental but was triggered by an unexpected event. Forensic details were revisited under this lens. The large volume of blood, which prosecutors had described as evidence of multiple blows, could also result from scalp wounds inflicted by talons. The absence of skull fractures aligned with this theory as well, since an owl attack would not involve blunt force. The defense noted that some of the questions left open by both the fall and the blunt instrument explanations were better answered by the owl hypothesis. Still, they admitted it was only a hypothesis and not direct proof. Prosecutors dismissed the owl theory as speculative. They argued that no one had seen such an attack, and that the staircase scene still pointed to intentional violence. To them, raising the possibility of an owl attack was a way to confuse the jury and distract from stronger evidence. They pointed out that introducing wildlife into the case lacked precedent and risked making the process seem less serious. For this reason, the theory was never formally argued in the courtroom during Peterson's trial. Outside the courtroom, however, the owl theory gained attention in media reports and public discussions. Some commentators viewed it as far-fetched, while others considered it a credible explanation overlooked in the rush to judgment. The idea highlighted how forensic evidence can be interpreted in radically different ways depending on the framework applied. It also showed how uncertainty continued to surround Kathleen's death, even years after the verdict. The Peterson defense team did not make the owl theory their central argument but did keep it in circulation. They used it to underline the larger point that there were plausible alternatives to the prosecution's version. By showing that even an unusual idea could fit many of the facts, they argued, the state's case could not be considered certain. In the context of a retrial, any doubt about the original narrative worked in Peterson's favor. For those who followed the case, the owl theory came to symbolize the complexity of the evidence. It was not proof, but it was another way the same injuries and blood patterns could be read. The case, already long and tangled, now carried this additional possibility into the discussions about Peterson's future. As the legal process moved toward resolution, attention shifted away from courtroom battles over birds and bloodstains to the more practical matter of how the case would end. With years already lost to prison and retrial still pending, Peterson and his attorneys faced a decision. The option of an Alford plea, a rare legal tool allowing a defendant to plead guilty while maintaining innocence, entered the discussion. By 2017, after more than 15 years of legal battles, Michael Peterson faced the choice of whether to endure another full trial or to resolve the case in a different way. The prosecution was prepared to retry him for the murder of Kathleen Peterson, and the defense was ready to challenge the state's evidence, including the discredited bloodstain testimony. But the prospect of reliving years of hearings, witnesses, and uncertainty weighed heavily on everyone involved. At this point, Peterson was 73 years old and had already spent 8 years in prison before being released on bond. A new trial could take years more and carried the risk of another life sentence. The option presented was an Alford plea. In U.S. law, this plea allows a defendant to accept a guilty verdict while maintaining that they are not admitting to the act itself. It is a compromise. The court treats the defendant as guilty, but the defendant does not concede guilt in their own words. For Peterson, this meant he could avoid another trial, accept the charge legally, and be sentenced to time already served. It was not a declaration of innocence, but it was also not an open confession. In court, Peterson stood before the judge and entered the Alford plea to a charge of voluntary manslaughter. The judge confirmed that by doing so, Peterson was legally accepting responsibility for Kathleen's death. The sentence was entered as time served, meaning Peterson was free to leave without returning to prison. The legal system closed the case on its own terms. For the state, the conviction stood. For Peterson, his claim of innocence remained unchanged. Reactions were divided. The prosecution called the plea a form of accountability, a recognition that Kathleen did not die by accident. They emphasized that Peterson's guilty plea, no matter how it was framed, validated the state's position. Members of Kathleen's family echoed this view, saying the legal record now confirmed Peterson's guilt. They said the plea brought some measure of closure, even if it had taken many years. The defense saw it differently. They described the Alford plea as a practical exit from a process that had dragged on too long. They insisted Peterson took the deal not because he believed himself guilty but because the risk of another trial was too great. Supporters said the plea allowed him to live his remaining years outside prison rather than gamble with the uncertainties of another jury. To them, the plea was a legal formality, not an admission of murder. The Peterson children were also divided. Some supported Michael, believing in his innocence and seeing the plea as a necessary compromise. Others, including Kathleen's daughter Caitlin, continued to believe in the state's version of events and viewed the plea as confirmation. The case left fractures within the family that did not heal with the stroke of a judge's pen. The Alford plea ended the trial process but did not end the personal conflict over what had really happened. Public reaction echoed these divisions. Some saw the resolution as unsatisfying, a halfway answer that left the truth unclear. Others accepted it as the best possible outcome given the years of disputes over evidence and expert testimony. The Alford plea, rare and often misunderstood, became a symbol of the uneasy compromise between law and fact in the Peterson case. When the court adjourned, Michael Peterson walked out a free man, though legally guilty. The sound of the gavel closing the proceeding carried less weight than the years of unanswered questions that remained. The staircase where Kathleen died still stood in the background of every discussion, unchanged but never free of suspicion. The case was legally finished, but the larger question, what really happened that night in 2001, remained unsettled. As Peterson moved on with his life outside prison, the debate continued among family, neighbors, and the public. The Alford plea did not silence those questions. It only shifted them into history, unresolved and lingering. With the plea entered and the file closed, the story circled back to its beginning. The 911 call, the blood on the stairs, and the two competing narratives were still in place. In the final step of this story, we return to that unanswered question: was Michael Peterson a killer neighbor or a wrongly accused husband? The story ends where it began, with a phone call and a staircase. In the early hours of December 9, 2001, Michael Peterson told a 911 dispatcher that his wife had fallen. Responders arrived to find blood on the steps, walls, and floor, and Kathleen lying at the bottom. From that moment, two paths diverged. One path said she slipped, struck her head, and bled heavily. The other said she was attacked with a blunt object. Both versions were carried into court, into public debate, and into the lives of everyone connected to the case. The evidence never stopped speaking in two voices. The medical examiner ruled homicide, pointing to multiple scalp lacerations. Yet the absence of skull fractures and brain injury left room for the defense to argue accident. The missing blow poke was offered as a weapon, but it was never recovered or tested. Bloodstain analysis was presented as certainty, but years later the reliability of that testimony collapsed. At every stage, what looked like clarity was shadowed by doubt. When prosecutors introduced the earlier death of Elizabeth Ratliff, the case gained a second staircase and a theory of pattern. Jurors heard that two women tied to Peterson had died in similar ways, and they treated this as proof of more than coincidence. The defense countered with the differences between the cases and the role of medical history. The result was not certainty but a layering of suspicion on top of suspicion. The two staircases became bound together in argument, whether or not they were truly linked. The trial ended with a guilty verdict, and Peterson entered prison. For years, it appeared the case had closed. Then the misconduct of bloodstain analyst Dwayne Deaver was exposed, and the foundation of the conviction was shaken. Peterson was granted a new trial and released on bond. The same evidence that once seemed to decide his guilt was shown to be less solid, less reliable, than jurors had been led to believe. The story reopened, and the question at its core returned. In that space of doubt, the owl theory appeared. Unconventional, it suggested that a barred owl might have attacked Kathleen outside, leaving scalp wounds and microscopic feathers. It did not replace the other explanations but stood beside them, a reminder of how many ways the same injuries could be read. It was never tested in court, but it underscored the uncertainty. Even a theory as unlikely as an animal attack seemed able to explain details left unanswered by either accident or assault. Years later, Peterson entered an Alford plea, a legal middle ground. He accepted a conviction for voluntary manslaughter while still claiming innocence. The state closed its file with a guilty plea on record. Peterson walked free after serving time equal to his sentence. To prosecutors and some family members, it was accountability. To Peterson and his defenders, it was a practical choice, not a confession. To observers, it was compromise without closure. The family remained divided. Some of Kathleen's relatives saw the plea as confirmation that Peterson was responsible for her death. Others, including two of his adopted daughters, continued to support him. The split reflected the larger public divide. For every voice certain of guilt, there was another convinced of accident or doubt. The case became less about one truth and more about the struggle over which story people chose to believe. 2 decades on, the Peterson case remains unsettled. Each piece of evidence can be explained in more than one way. Each theory leaves gaps that another fills. The story has been told in courtrooms, in books, and in films, but none has resolved the question. What happened that night in 2001 continues to stand between certainty and doubt. The staircase itself remains unchanged. Wood steps, narrow and steep, holding the memory of a night that altered many lives. Investigators, lawyers, and jurors tried to interpret what it showed, but the marks on the walls never gave one clear answer. The case begins and ends with that staircase, silent but central. In the end, the question posed from the start still walks beside the story: was Michael Peterson a killer neighbor or a wrongly accused husband? The law has given its answer, but the debate has not stopped. What remains is the echo of a single creak on the stairs, a sound tied to uncertainty, fading into the silence of an unfinished conclusion.